It was a stormy night in the outskirts of a small southern town. Rain lashed against the windows of Martha Henderson's modest home as the wind howled through the creaky wooden frames. Inside, Martha was trying to quiet her two young daughters, ages 5 and 3, who were anxious from the thunder. Life had never been easy for Martha, a woman of remarkable resilience and grit. After her husband's untimely death in a work accident, she was left alone, scrambling to make ends meet as a waitress in the only diner in town. But tonight, as she settled her children into their shared bed, the unexpected sound of a faint wailing outside cut through the roar of the storm. She froze, her heart pounding. It wasn't the wind or the eerie groaning of the old house, it was a cry. She hesitated, peering through the foggy glass, only to find darkness and sheets of rain. But the cry persisted, thin and desperate. Grabbing her old raincoat, she pulled it over her shoulders and braved the tempestuous weather to investigate. Opening the door, she gasped. A tiny bundle lay on her porch, soaked and trembling. It was a baby, no older than a few months, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. His skin was dark and smooth, contrasting starkly against the pale blue fabric. He looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, his cries now barely a whimper. Martha's mind raced. Who would leave a child out here in such weather? And why? Before we dive into this fascinating story, please share a comment with the community, letting us know where you're watching from. It helps us connect and bring you even more engaging stories. Standing on her front porch, rain soaking her hair, Martha glanced around, but the street was empty. No one was in sight, and there were no footprints in the mud. She knelt beside the baby, her hands trembling as she gently lifted him. He was cold, frighteningly so. Dear God, she breathed, pulling him close to her chest. There was no note, no sign of who he was or why he had been left here. Martha knew the responsible thing to do was to call the authorities. They'd take him to a shelter, find him a safe place. But as she stood there, feeling the faint, shivering life in her arms, something in her heart tightened. She glanced back at her small, cluttered house, where her daughters were finally drifting to sleep in their worn-out pajamas. How could she take in another child when she could barely afford food for the two she had? Yet, as she looked into his eyes, so full of fear and confusion, she felt a surge of protectiveness. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the sheer helplessness in his gaze, or maybe it was the way his tiny fingers clutched the edge of her coat. Before she knew it, she'd stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. The next days were a blur. Martha juggled her job, her daughters, and now a newborn who required constant care. Her neighbors, a mix of curious onlookers and disapproving faces, whispered behind her back. A black baby with a white woman? It didn't sit well with many, and some openly suggested she should hand him over. But Martha, despite the mounting challenges, felt a fierce determination to protect this child. She named him Joshua. When she took him to the local clinic, the nurse's skeptical eyes scanned the boy. "He doesn't look like yours," the nurse said bluntly. "Are you fostering?" Martha's jaw tightened, but she simply shook her head. "He's mine now," she replied quietly, leaving no room for further questions. With each passing day, Martha grew more attached to the baby. He was a fighter, clinging to life despite his weak start. But the town's whispers turned into murmurs, and soon, even the owner of the diner where she worked started hinting that her situation was causing trouble. Martha's daughters, young as they were, sensed the tension. "Why is he different?" her eldest Emma asked one evening, her small brow furrowed. "Why do people stare?" Martha sighed, pulling both girls close. "Because sometimes people don't understand. But we love him, don't we?" "Yes," little Katie whispered, touching Joshua's tiny hand. "He's our baby brother." But Martha couldn't ignore the cold looks at the grocery store, or the fact that her hours at work had been quietly cut. Bills piled up, and soon she was selling off whatever she could to keep the electricity running. One day, she received an anonymous note shoved under her door. "Do yourself and that boy a favor. Give him up." Shaking, she crumpled the paper and threw it away, but the words haunted her. Was she being selfish? Was she really giving Joshua a good life? The question gnawed at her during every sleepless night. Yet, every time she looked at his tiny face, she knew she'd made the right choice. 6 months after Joshua arrived, Martha's situation grew dire. Her hours had been slashed again, and she was barely scraping by. One evening, she found herself pacing the kitchen, staring at the empty pantry. If she didn't pay the rent soon, they'd be out on the street. Desperation clawed at her. She picked up the phone, dialing the child services number, her hands trembling. But just as the call connected, Joshua let out a soft coo from his crib. Martha turned, tears streaming down her face. Slowly, she hung up. "No, I won't," she whispered fiercely. This was her son, and she would fight to keep him, no matter what. Martha's decision to keep Joshua was final, but it came at a steep cost. The very next day, as she showed up at the diner, her boss, Roy, a stout man with a graying mustache, shook his head gravely. "Martha, I can't keep you on anymore," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Customers, they're not comfortable." "Not comfortable?" Martha repeated, her voice strained. She gripped the counter to steady herself. "Because I took in a baby who needed a home?" Roy shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on his apron. "It's not just that, it's the gossip, the situation. I've got to think about business." Tears pricked Martha's eyes, but she swallowed them back, straightening her shoulders. "Please, Roy, I need this job. I've got 3 kids now." But his gaze was firm. "I'm sorry, Martha. I really am. You can pick up your final pay at the end of the week." As she walked out of the diner, her heart heavy, Martha knew she was on her own. The stares, the gossip, the whispers behind her back, none of it mattered now. What mattered was keeping her family together. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of every possible way she could earn money. Babysitting, cleaning houses, anything. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She just needed a chance. The next day, Martha took a deep breath and knocked on the door of Mrs. Reynolds, an elderly woman who lived down the street. Mrs. Reynolds, known for her stern demeanor and sharp tongue, raised an eyebrow when she opened the door. "What do you want?" she asked brusquely, eyeing Martha's disheveled appearance. "I'm looking for work, ma'am. I know you need help around the house, maybe some cleaning or yard work. I can cook too." Martha's voice trembled slightly, but she held Mrs. Reynolds' gaze. "I don't need much, just enough to get by." For a long moment, Mrs. Reynolds said nothing. Then, to Martha's surprise, her expression softened ever so slightly. "I suppose I could use some help," she muttered, almost grudgingly. "Come by tomorrow, early." Martha blinked in disbelief. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you." Mrs. Reynolds waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. We'll see how long you last." The work was grueling. Mrs. Reynolds had a large property, and Martha spent hours scrubbing floors, washing windows, and trimming hedges until her muscles ached. But she never complained. Every dollar she earned went straight to keeping food on the table and the rent paid. And slowly, bit by bit, Mrs. Reynolds' gruff exterior began to crack. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" the older woman said one afternoon, watching as Martha knelt to polish the brass door handles. "Have to be," Martha replied simply, glancing up. "I've got 3 kids to think about." Mrs. Reynolds' eyes lingered on Martha's tired face. 3, and one's not yours?" "He's mine," Martha said firmly. "He's as much mine as the other 2. Mrs. Reynolds' gaze softened just a fraction. "I suppose that makes you stronger than most." Winter crept in, bringing with it a bitter chill. Money was tighter than ever, and Martha found herself skipping meals to make sure her children had enough to eat. But one day, as she arrived at Mrs. Reynolds' house, she found a large basket waiting for her on the porch, filled with groceries and a thick woolen blanket. Her eyes widened. "Mrs. Reynolds, I can't." "Don't start with that nonsense," Mrs. Reynolds snapped from the doorway. "You're working for it, aren't you? Consider it a bonus." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the basket. It was more than just food. It was hope. And hope was something she desperately needed. But as winter passed, something darker loomed on the horizon. One icy evening, as Martha tucked Joshua in, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a tall man in a crisp suit standing on her porch. His presence was imposing, and Martha's stomach twisted with unease. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, his voice cold and clipped. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I'm representing the child's biological father," he said, handing her a thick envelope. "He's filed for custody. We'll see you in court." The words hit Martha like a punch to the gut. "Custody?" she gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. But he abandoned Joshua. That's for the court to decide, the man replied smoothly. My client has recently become aware of his child's situation and believes he can provide a better environment. A better environment? Martha's voice shook with rage. He's trying to take my son. The man's expression remained impassive. I suggest you get a lawyer. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Martha standing in the doorway, the wind whipping around her, the envelope heavy in her hands. Word of the custody battle spread quickly. Some in the town rallied behind Martha, praising her for raising Joshua when no one else would. But others sided with the mysterious father, arguing that the boy would be better off in a wealthier home. Even Mrs. Reynolds, normally so stoic, looked troubled when Martha told her the news. He can't just take him, Martha said desperately, sitting at Mrs. Reynolds' kitchen table. He can't. Money talks, dear, Mrs. Reynolds murmured, shaking her head. And if he's got the right lawyers. But Joshua is mine, Martha cried, her voice breaking. I've been there for him every day. I'm his mother. Mrs. Reynolds reached out and grasped Martha's trembling hand. You're going to fight this, she said quietly, and you're not going to do it alone. To Martha's astonishment, people began to step forward. The local church, led by Pastor Green, offered to hold fundraisers to help cover her legal fees. Parents at her daughter's school collected donations. Even Roy, the diner owner who'd fired her, showed up at her doorstep with an envelope of cash. I didn't do right by you, Martha, he admitted, his voice thick with regret. But this is different. As support poured in, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could win. But the legal battle was just beginning. The first court hearing was a nightmare. The biological father, a wealthy businessman named Charles Armstrong, sat across the room, his face hard and unyielding. He barely glanced at Martha, his focus solely on Joshua. The lawyers argued, papers were presented, and every moment felt like a knife twisting in Martha's chest. Mr. Armstrong can provide a stable, affluent home, his lawyer argued smoothly. The child deserves to know his true family. Martha's lawyer, a kind woman working pro bono, stood up, her gaze fierce. And what about the family he already knows? The mother who has raised him, loved him, and sacrificed everything for him. Armstrong's lawyer smirked. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, counselor. The courtroom felt cold and sterile, every word from the opposing counsel like a dagger to Martha's heart. Charles Armstrong sat confidently on the other side, his expensive suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to Martha's humble appearance. She could see him stealing glances at Joshua, who sat quietly beside her, his small hands clasped tightly around hers. He doesn't even know him, she wanted to shout, but she bit back her anger, clinging to her composure. She had to stay strong, for Joshua's sake. But when Armstrong's lawyer presented the next piece of evidence, Martha's heart nearly stopped. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Henderson is currently unemployed, barely scraping by on temporary cleaning jobs. The lawyer said smoothly, handing a stack of papers to the judge. This is not a stable environment for a child, especially when Mr. Armstrong can offer a secure, comfortable home. The judge's gaze shifted to Martha, his expression unreadable. Is this true, Mrs. Henderson? Yes, but... Thank you, the lawyer interrupted, turning away dismissively. Mr. Armstrong only wants what's best for his son. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Martha felt a wave of panic rising in her chest. Everything she had done, every sleepless night, every sacrifice was being used against her. Joshua squeezed her hand, looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes. Mom? He whispered softly, and Martha's heart broke all over again. It's okay, baby, she whispered back, her voice trembling. But inside, fear clawed at her. How could she compete with a man like Charles Armstrong? Just when Martha thought things couldn't get worse, Armstrong's lawyer called a surprise witness. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Martha's jaw dropped in shock as she walked in. Janice Wilson, her estranged sister, dressed in a smart suit, her gaze cold. What are you doing here? Martha breathed, disbelief and betrayal coursing through her veins. Miss Wilson, the lawyer said, ignoring Martha's outburst, could you please tell the court about your sister's ability to care for a child? Janice glanced at Martha, her expression unreadable. I'm worried about Joshua's well-being, she said quietly. Martha's struggling. She's always been reckless, impulsive, I just want what's best for the boy." Martha's world tilted. Her own sister, the one person she thought she could still trust. "You're lying," she cried, half rising from her seat. "Why are you doing this?" The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." But Janice wouldn't look at her. She kept her gaze on the lawyer, her face stiff. Martha sank back down, numb with shock. Her sister had sold her out. For what? Money? Revenge? Martha couldn't comprehend it, but the damage was done. The whispers among the audience grew louder. Doubt rippled through the courtroom. After days of grueling testimonies and emotional pleas, the final day of the hearing arrived. Martha sat rigid in her chair, her stomach churning. This was it, the moment that would decide Joshua's fate. After careful consideration, the judge began, looking down at them with a solemn expression, "I have reached a decision." Martha's heart pounded in her ears. She held her breath, clutching Joshua's hand so tightly she could feel his pulse racing beneath her fingers. Mr. Armstrong has demonstrated that he can provide a financially stable and comfortable home. However, the judge paused, his gaze shifting to Joshua, who looked up at him with wide, anxious eyes. This court must also consider the emotional well-being of the child and the strength of the existing bond. Martha dared not move. Was it hope she felt, or the calm before the storm? I find that while Mr. Armstrong is capable of providing materially, Mrs. Henderson has shown a deep, unwavering commitment to Joshua's well-being, despite significant hardships. The bond between them cannot be overlooked. Armstrong's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down, counselor," the judge said sharply. "I'm awarding full custody of Joshua to Martha Henderson." The room erupted in murmurs. Armstrong's face darkened, his mouth set in a thin line. But all Martha could do was stare at the judge, hardly daring to believe it. "What did he say?" Joshua whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "Mom, what did he say?" He said, you're staying with me," she choked out, pulling him into her arms. Relief, joy, and exhaustion crashed over her in a dizzying wave. She clung to Joshua, burying her face in his hair as he wrapped his small arms around her. "Order! Order in the court!" The judge shouted over the commotion, but Martha didn't care. She had won. Against all odds, she had won. Charles Armstrong stormed out of the courtroom, his face twisted with fury. But just as he reached the door, Mrs. Reynolds, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stepped forward. "Mr. Armstrong," she called out sharply. He turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "I'm the one who's been watching what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You tried to buy that boy, just like you buy everything else. But some things aren't for sale." Armstrong's face flushed. "Mind your own business, old woman." "I am," she retorted coolly, "because that boy is part of this community, and we take care of our own." Armstrong stared at her for a moment, then turned on his heel and stalked out, his shoulders stiff with rage.
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
Mrs. Reynolds turned to Martha, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "Told you, didn't I? You're not alone." Martha, still shaking from the ordeal, managed a weak smile in return. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." "You would have," Mrs. Reynolds said briskly, "but it's always nice to have a few friends." That evening, as Martha returned home with Joshua and her daughters, exhausted but triumphant, a knock sounded on the door. Her heart leapt. Had Armstrong come back to try again? But when she opened the door, it wasn't Armstrong standing there. It was Janice, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why are you here?" Martha asked coldly, stepping forward protectively. "I came to apologize," Janice whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. "He paid me, Martha. He offered me money, and I'm so sorry." Martha stared at her sister, a storm of emotions raging inside her. Anger, pain, disbelief. "You sold us out," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You betrayed your own family for money." "I know," Janice sobbed. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself. But please, can I see him? Just once?" Martha hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "No, not now. Maybe someday, but not now." With that, she closed the door softly, leaning against it as Janice's muffled sobs faded away. She looked down at Joshua, who gazed up at her with wide eyes. "Who was that, Mommy?" Martha took a deep breath, then smiled. "No one important, sweetheart. No one at all." A month had passed since the court ruling, but the victory still felt surreal to Martha. The threat of losing Joshua had loomed over her like a dark cloud for so long that she almost didn't know how to feel now that it was gone. Life wasn't easier by any means. Money was still tight, and every day brought its own challenges. But there was a peace in her heart that hadn't been there before. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and sunlight streamed through the small kitchen window as Martha set out breakfast. Joshua and the girls chatted animatedly at the table, their laughter filling the tiny space. She couldn't help but smile as she watched them, their bond stronger than ever after everything they had endured together. "I want more pancakes," Katie announced, her curly hair bouncing as she grinned up at her mother. "Me too," Joshua added, his eyes bright. "Hold your horses, you two," Martha teased, flipping another pancake onto their plates. "You're going to eat me out of house and home at this rate." As they giggled and dug into their food, Martha's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, her smile fading. It was a message from Janice. "Please, just talk to me. I'm sorry." Martha's chest tightened, but she quickly set the phone aside. She wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. She didn't know if she could ever trust her sister again after what she had done. But for now, she wouldn't let the past spoil this moment. She turned back to the kids, determined to savor every precious second of this normal, happy morning. Later that afternoon, as Martha was tidying up the yard, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the house. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it Charles Armstrong? She stood frozen, a cold dread creeping down her spine as the car door opened. But it wasn't Armstrong who stepped out. It was the same lawyer who had represented him in court. The sight of his sharp suit and serious expression made Martha's pulse race. "What do you want?" she called out, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson," he said calmly, approaching with a file folder in hand. "I'm not here to cause trouble. In fact, I'm here to make amends." Martha narrowed her eyes, wariness prickling her skin. "Amends?" she repeated skeptically. The lawyer nodded. "Mr. Armstrong has decided not to pursue any further legal action. He acknowledges that Joshua belongs with you." Relief flooded Martha, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. Why? He fought so hard to take him away. Why would he suddenly give up? The lawyer's gaze softened slightly. "Let's just say that after some reflection, he realized that no amount of money could replace the bond you have with Joshua." Martha's breath caught. Was that regret she saw in the man's eyes? "So that's it?" she asked slowly. "He's just letting us be?" "Yes." The lawyer handed her the folder. "And he wanted you to have this." With shaking hands, Martha opened the folder. Inside was a letter addressed to her, along with several official documents. Her eyes widened as she skimmed the contents. Charles Armstrong was transferring a trust fund to Joshua's name, along with a substantial monthly stipend for his education and well-being. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. "A gesture of goodwill," the lawyer replied quietly, "and an acknowledgement of everything you've done for the boy. Mr. Armstrong knows he can never make up for his past mistakes, but he hopes this will help give Joshua the future he deserves." Martha stared down at the documents, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After everything, could she really accept this? But as she thought of Joshua, his future, his dreams, she knew what she had to do. "Tell him, thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "And tell him, I'll make sure Joshua knows who he is someday." The lawyer nodded solemnly, then turned and walked back to his car, leaving Martha standing on the porch, the papers clutched tightly in her hands. Life didn't change overnight, but the weight on Martha's shoulders lifted, little by little. With the new support from the trust fund, she was able to quit her grueling cleaning jobs and focus on something that had always been a distant dream, opening a small daycare center in her own home. She poured her heart into it, using her experience as a mother and caregiver to create a warm, welcoming space for children from all walks of life. Joshua and the girls flourished. With the trust fund, she was able to enroll him in a better school, where he quickly made friends and discovered a passion for art. Watching him sketch with fierce concentration at the kitchen table one evening, Martha felt a swell of pride that nearly brought her to tears. "You're going to be famous one day," she teased gently, ruffling his hair. Joshua grinned up at her, his eyes shining. Only if you're there to cheer me on, Mom. Years passed, and as Joshua grew, so did his dreams. He worked hard in school, his natural talent for drawing blossoming into a full-fledged career aspiration. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, he turned to Martha, his expression serious. "Mom, I've been thinking. I want to meet him." Martha's heart skipped a beat. She knew this day would come, but it still took her by surprise. "Charles?" she asked quietly. Joshua nodded. "He's my father. I need to understand where I come from. Is that okay?" Martha swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "Of course it is," she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. "But remember, no matter what you find, you'll always have a home here." Joshua smiled softly. "I know, I'll always come back, Mom, I promise." And so, one sunny morning, Martha watched from the porch as Joshua climbed into a car, ready to meet the man who had once tried to take him away. Her heart was heavy with a mix of fear and hope, but she knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened, they would always be family. As the car disappeared down the road, Martha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. She turned back to the house, where Emma and Katie were already clamoring for breakfast, and smiled. They had been through so much together, heartache, betrayal, and fear, but they had survived. And now, at long last, they were free to build the future they had fought so hard to protect. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who love heartwarming stories of perseverance and love. Your support helps us bring more inspiring content like this to life. And if you're ready for another moving tale, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.